Welcome to Crime Scene X. Today's video will cover 3 horror stories that happened in prison. If you enjoyed today's video, leave a like, comment down below, and subscribe for daily uploads. Sit back and enjoy the video. I was never a man who scared easily. The streets had hardened me long before I got sentenced to this godforsaken place. You learn quick when you grow up in a rough neighborhood. Fear is a luxury you can't afford. But prisons have a pecking order, and when you're the new guy, you find your place fast, or you don't find it at all. I thought I could handle it, blend into the background noise of violence and despair. That was until I met Keith. From the moment I stepped into Block C, I knew something was wrong. Inmates whispered behind my back, throwing surreptitious glances like they were waiting for something to happen. When I asked what was going on, my cellmate Mark just shook his head. "Don't worry about it," he muttered, but his eyes betrayed him. They were filled with a fear that made my stomach churn. And then I saw him. Keith. He was a giant of a man, with arms like tree trunks and a glare that could make a grown man cry. Tattoos covered his body, cryptic symbols and phrases that hinted at a life dedicated to brutality. But it was his eyes that caught me, the eyes of a predator sizing up his prey. For days I felt his gaze on me, always lurking somewhere in the periphery. Meals in the cafeteria became a game of nerve. Every time I looked up, I found him staring from across the room, a sickening grin stretching across his face. "He's planning something," Mark told me one night. His voice was barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid the walls would hear him. "Keith doesn't play games. If he's got his eyes on you, it's for a reason." That night, sleep eluded me. The darkness in the cell felt heavier, charged with an unseen menace. Time ticked by, each second stretching into an eternity. And then it happened. The cell door creaked open, a feat supposedly impossible without a guard's key. But there he was, Keith, standing in the dim light that filtered in from the corridor. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled to my feet, realizing too late that I had nothing to defend myself with. Keith stepped into the cell, his eyes locked onto mine. There was no turning back. "I've been watching you," he hissed, his voice oozing with malice. "You don't belong here, and I'm going to show you why." As he lunged at me, I dodged instinctively, my adrenaline pumping so fast that time seemed to slow. My hand found a loose piece of metal hidden under Mark's mattress, a makeshift shiv. Gripping it tightly, I spun around just as Keith charged again. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the world stood still. Then with a swift, decisive motion, I drove the shiv into his side. Keith screamed, a guttural sound of pure animalistic rage, but it was too late. The damage was done. Clutching his side, Keith staggered back, his eyes burning with an unholy fire. And then he laughed, a chilling, soul-crushing laugh that echoed long after he had retreated from my cell. The guards arrived moments later, alerted by the noise. Keith was taken to the infirmary, then placed in solitary confinement. An investigation was launched, but no one could explain how he had managed to open the cell door. It was as if he had simply willed it open. I should have felt safe, victorious even, but the horror of that night stayed with me. Keith was eventually transferred to a maximum security facility, but his presence lingered, like a ghost you can't exorcise. Days turned into weeks, then months. I kept to myself, avoiding eye contact and doing my time in silence, but the damage was irreversible. I was marked now, a man who had stared into the abyss and felt it stare back. The other inmates sensed it, keeping their distance like I was a ticking time bomb. But it wasn't their rejection that terrified me. It was the fear that one day I might become like Keith, a monster, created not by nature, but by the twisted world we found ourselves in. And in that thought, I found the greatest horror of all, the realization that the prison wasn't just a place, but a mirror, reflecting the darkest corners of our souls. I had always thought prisons were places where time seemed to stop, but Fairburn Correctional Facility proved me wrong. Here, time didn't just stop, it seemed to warp, twist, and decay. Yet nothing prepared me for the isolation chamber they like to call the box. I found myself there after a minor altercation with another inmate named Benny. Words were exchanged, and before I knew it, fists were flying. It was over almost as quickly as it started. but the guards took me to solitary confinement. The box was a room about 6 feet by 8, a mattress on the floor, a toilet in the corner, and a small slot in the door for meals. But what made the box a living nightmare were the guards, specifically Officers Thompson and Gaines. Thompson was the older of the two, with a disdainful look permanently etched onto his face. Gaines was younger but equally cruel, always eager to follow Thompson's lead. They made it their mission to make the lives of inmates in solitary as miserable as possible, exploiting their authority under the guise of maintaining discipline. "Look who's in the penthouse suite," Thompson sneered as he slammed the cell door shut behind me. "Try not to enjoy yourself too much," Gaines chimed in, chuckling. The first couple of days were hard, but tolerable. Then their real game began. The food they delivered through the slot became progressively worse. First, stale bread, then meals with ingredients I couldn't identify. But that wasn't the worst of it. "Do you hear that?" Thompson would say, standing just outside my door. "That's your life ticking away." "I bet you're missing Benny now, huh?" Gaines would add, his voice tinged with malevolent glee. It was psychological warfare, their words slithering into my thoughts, wrapping around my sanity. The confinement alone was punishing, but the incessant verbal jabs made each minute stretch into an hour, each hour into an eternity. I'd lie on the mattress, staring at the ceiling, their voices echoing in my mind. Time lost all meaning. The room became my universe, a black hole from which there was no escape, no respite. I could feel myself fraying at the edges, my sense of self slowly eroding. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, my stint in solitary came to an end. Thompson unlocked the cell door, a triumphant grin on his face. "I hope you've learned your lesson," he said, as if he were a teacher and I a wayward student. As I stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light of the corridor, I felt like an alien in a world I no longer recognized. But amid the disorientation, a glimmer of clarity broke through. I returned to the general population a changed man, not broken but fortified. I couldn't erase the experience, nor could I forget Thompson and Gaines, but I could choose how to let it define me. Their words, intended to tear me down, had instead laid the foundation for a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. Months passed, then years. I earned my release, not just from Fairburn, but from the grasp of Thompson and Gaines' psychological torment. When I walked out of those gates, I left behind not just a cell, but a cocoon. What they had failed to understand was that the darkest places often serve as the crucibles for transformation. They'd put me in a box, but in doing so, they'd opened up a universe of possibility that stretched far beyond those walls. When they told me I was being transferred to Willow Falls Penitentiary, I thought I might finally catch a break. Willow Falls had a reputation for being more progressive, with a focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment. But my first few days there quickly shattered that illusion. The inmates were like wolves, smelling fear and weakness a mile away, and I was the proverbial lamb. The real problem started when I crossed paths with a man named Red. Red was as charismatic as he was dangerous. He had a way of making horrible things sound reasonable, even necessary. The man had a network of inmates who did his bidding, and before I knew it, I was sucked into his dark orbit. Red took me aside one day. "Listen, I've got a job for you. Easy stuff, really, but you've got to do it if you want to survive in this place." What choice did I have? "Sure," I said cautiously. "What do you need?" He told me he needed someone on the inside of the infirmary, someone who could swipe medication. It was risky, but again, saying no to Red wasn't really an option. So I found myself applying for janitorial work in the infirmary, and a couple of weeks later, sneaking out pills for Red and his crew. Life became marginally better. The beating stopped, and I had a sense of, albeit twisted, community. But then things took a horrific turn. Red cornered me one day, his eyes narrow slits. "We're running an operation, a big one. We need you to take it up a notch. Instead of swiping pills, you're going to plant evidence in another inmate's cell. Drugs, shanks, whatever you can get. The guy's a snitch, and he needs to be dealt with." I felt like the walls were closing in on me. Planting evidence was a whole different ballgame. It was a direct violation that could get me years added to my sentence. Red could see the reluctance on my face. "You don't really have a choice, buddy," he said, the threat thinly veiled. So I did it. Late one night, I crept into the cell of the man Red had pointed out to me and planted a makeshift shank under his mattress, along with some stolen medications. My hands were trembling the entire time. Less than 24 hours later, the prison was on lockdown. They'd found the planted items during a random cell search, and the inmate was hauled off to solitary, screaming about his innocence. Despite the turmoil, I felt a momentary sense of relief. Maybe this would be the end of it. That feeling was short-lived. A week later, new evidence magically appeared, evidence that pointed to me as the one who'd planted the contraband. It didn't take long for the investigators to connect the dots. I was interrogated, and despite my insistence that I was being set up, I received an additional 5 years on my sentence for conspiracy to commit violence and distribution of controlled substances. As I was led back to my cell, I saw Red from across the yard. He winked at me and turned away, laughing with his gang. It was a setup from the start. He'd eliminated a snitch and hung me out to dry at the same time. My life became a waking nightmare. Inmates knew I had additional time, and that made me a pariah. I was a walking target. My nights were sleepless, filled with anxiety and regret. Red and his crew continued their reign, and I was isolated, cast away into a spiraling descent of fear and despair. Each day became a struggle, each night an exercise in terror. I had fallen into a trap of my own making, ensnared by my choices and their terrible consequences. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please like the video, comment what you thought, and subscribe for daily uploads.